You're watching the 5th Annual Assembly of Planners Symposium, held on February 20, 2020, at the Taitano, Guam Resort. The symposium's agenda centered on 3 main tracks: on flood control, land use planning, and zero waste, and featured other presentations, including remarks by Governor Lujan Guerrero and Lieutenant Governor Joshua Tenora. The symposium was organized by the Bureau of Statistics and Plans Guam Coastal Management Program with a grant from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. The theme of this year's symposium is Creating a Clear Vision in a Changing Climate. Coming up, this segment will feature welcoming remarks, as well as opening remarks by Governor Lujan Guerrero, and also the Climate Change Resiliency Commission report by Commission Chair Evangeline Lujan.
To kick things off, will you help me welcome my director, Mr. Tyrone Taitano, to the podium to begin our 5th Assembly of Planners Symposium.
I have 2 tasks this morning. The first one is to welcome you all to the 2020 Assembly of Planners Symposium. Registration is now, at last count, it was well over 200, which amounts a 50% increase in registrants from last year. So it's very encouraging and inspiring to see this program move forward now in its 5th year from strength to strength. I want to thank, as Edwin did, all of the people who have made this event possible, in particular, the hardworking staff of the Bureau of Statistics and Plans. Between this and the census, they're very well stretched nowadays. And especially Edwin Rangers and his team in the Guam Coastal Zone Management Program, which, as he's noted, is funded by a grant from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, ably represented by Maria Young. My thanks also to my sister GovGuam agencies and their directors for the support for this event. So thank you to Director of Land Management Joe Borja, Director of Agriculture Chester Munoz-Brecht, and the Administrator for the Guam Environmental Protection Agency, Walter Leon Guerrero. And I also want to especially welcome our off-island guests from the CNMI and the American Samoa, and also the States, especially those of you who have traveled here to make presentations for the symposium, so in particular those from the Army Corps of Engineers and from Jacobs Engineering. I also wish to, again, thank our partner PBS Guam, who will be taping just about all these proceedings for broadcast later on KGTF and also on the government channels on Docomo and GTA. The second task I have today is to welcome our next speaker. Aside from making history as our island's first female governor, Governor Lujan Guerrero has brought to her the post she's taken up a year ago with I think it can very safely said, a broadest variety of experiences that any of her predecessors brought to the post. She started out her professional life as a nurse, working in both clinics and hospitals on Guam and in the mainland, and has even succeeded to take on nursing management positions in both the public and private sectors. She remains today a registered nurse that's kept up her licensure. So for those of you in the next few minutes who feel a medical distress or may feel faint, as consciousness slips away from you, you can be consoled by the fact that medical attention is close at hand. Actually, I sort of joke about it, but this has been realized a couple of times over the past year during the governor's first year. There was this one incident last year where there was this big gathering in the cabinet conference room, as there often is for things like proclamation signings. And this one elderly woman actually fainted, and everyone gathered around to do what they can to take care of her. And someone said, she needs help. And someone else said, a nurse is coming. And as if on cue, racing into the cabinet conference room was Governor Lujan Guerrero to take care of her newest patient. Trailing the governor was her security detail and staff running to keep up with her. So that incident turned out well, but it sort of speaks to the depth of experience she brings to the job. In addition to being a successful nurse, she also had a successful career in the Guam legislature. And probably the major hallmark or testament to that success is not the 5 terms that she was elected to, but the fact that much of the legislation she achieved as a senator still contributes to the success of this community today, including legislation that established the Healthy Futures Fund, and also the Natasha Act, which bans smoking in clubs and restaurants. After her time in the legislature, she also, as many of you know, took the helm of the Bank of Guam and was, by any objective standard, remarkably successful, having doubling the assets of the Bank of Guam in the space of about 10 years. So these are the talents and skills she's brought to her position as governor in what has been a very busy first year. She has helped stabilize government's chaotic finances. She's recruited 100 new law enforcement officers as part of a broader public safety initiative. She's expanded the availability of new affordable housing, and she has fulfilled the long-awaited promise of war reparations for our Manumco. But in addition to dealing with the demands of the day, Governor Lujan Guerrero has always kept her eye on the future. Last June, she implemented a new coral reef resiliency strategy to help defend our reefs from the assault from climate change, which has resulted in several major bleaching events over the last few years, which has devastated our coral reefs, and help prepare for what is expected increased frequency and severity of coral bleaching events between now and the end of the century. She also has established a Guam Climate Change Resiliency Commission to come up with a broader strategy to deal with climate change, and by executive order has adopted the UN Sustainable Development Goals for our island. She has also created the Zero Waste Working Group that is chaired by First Gentleman Jeff Cook that is working on measures to build the green economy, which has to be the cornerstone for the sustainable Guam we all want. These long range and far-reaching initiatives, as I believe, have been greeted with a great deal of hope by many sectors of our community here. But it has to be acknowledged that for some, it will be treated with skepticism, if not cynicism. And as you know, it's sort of hard to argue against some of this cynicism because we are all aware of our disappointments with past government performance. We're all aware of mistakes our community has made. And if we forget any of that, there's any number of sources in the mass media and social media who will remind us of all these past mistakes. But even so, I think it's fair to say that cynicism is the easy path. It's easy to be cynical. The much harder and braver path is the path that our governor has chosen, which is to have faith in Guam's future and believe with conviction that by working together, we can solve the challenges before us. So with that, it's my privilege and a great deal of pride that I introduce to you our Magahaga, the Honorable Lujan Guerrero, Governor of Guam.
Sidus Masi Tyrone, as I was listening to Tyrone, I'm thinking, Madam Speaker, I don't think I need to come and do my State of the Territory address, as you just heard it now from Tyrone. Thank you, Tyrone, for those very kind words. Let me just say that as I walked into the room, I felt so, satisfied. I felt that having a room of planners to sit down and plan the destiny of our island, and not just our island, but also CNMI, who's here, and also other island visitors that are here. It's great to be able to come together and share information so that we can improve our quality of life. And I am very pleased to be here with you, commending Tyrone and Edwin and all the other key stakeholders that was able to make this 2020 Assembly of Planners Symposium. Last year's symposium was one of the first public events I addressed as governor, and it is very encouraging to see this annual event continue and get stronger. My congratulations to the staff of Bureau of Statistics and Plans, and especially its Coastal Zone Management Program for all your hard work in organizing this event. A special Sidus Maasi to our off-island guests, who are not only attendees, but are also presenters, and look forward to hearing some of your good information. I also want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to attend this event. This symposium provides a valuable service not only to each of you as professionals, but also to our community as a whole. Yes, this gathering has the title of Assembly of Planners. However, if you have aspirations of your island's future, you are a planner because you are looking at the path ahead of us. In a very real sense, therefore, we are all planners to one degree or another. the issues covered by today's symposium agenda are the ones in which we all have a stake in. And I'm also very much excited about the theme. The theme, creating a clear vision with a changing climate. And the reason I'm excited about that is first, we have to have a clear vision. And we cannot have a clear vision if we don't know what the climate is ahead of us. And I think it's very appropriate now, I feel, to have that theme because we are confronted with a lot of challenges here, not just challenges in our environment, but social, political, economic challenges, security challenges. We're facing in this region the coronavirus situation, and we're working hard as leaders, and I'd like to thank the legislature for their support in making sure that we protect our people and that we protect our community, even if we have to make some very hard decisions. And we have to make those decisions. So I point that out only because in order for us to have a clear vision of what's ahead, we have to think about what the changes are ahead of us. I especially also like our initiatives that we have made forward, and you heard them from Tyrone. But they are initiatives that are very real. They are initiatives that we have to really implement and address. Because if we do, we will be able then to protect our environment and sustain our environment for not only us, but our children and our children's children. As a people, we have many hopes for the future of our island. We want a society that is fair and compassionate. We want a growing economy in which all our people share in its prosperity. We want to safeguard our environmental heritage and strengthen our culture. We want public services that more fully meet the needs of our people. We want to live in villages where our families and loved ones can feel safe. These are goals that we all share for this special island of ours and for this special region of ours. But as someone once said, a goal without a plan is just a wish. And we are not going to wish our problems away or realize our opportunities unless we do the hard, serious work of planning for the future. Our island's destiny is in large part to be shaped by the work you do in the planning community to prepare for that future. It is therefore hugely important that as our government focuses on meeting the needs of today, that we also invest effort and resources in planning for Guam's future needs. As is the case for so many of the issues confronting us, such as adapting to climate change, addressing social problems, building a strong, sustainable economy, protecting the natural beauty of our island, expanding opportunity, securing social justice, combating discrimination, and many, many others, progress and solutions in these areas can only be achieved through a process of collaboration, and not just between local government agencies, but also with our federal partners and the private sector as well. For this reason, I consider it vitally important to have opportunities like this gathering to share information, discuss the challenges before us, and come up with possible solutions to these challenges. That certainly is my hope for this symposium. And if any of you has a good idea about how we can improve our prospects for a Guam that is safe, compassionate, prosperous, and fair, then come on down to Adelup. And I am sure a member of my staff will want to take the time to listen to your ideas. And if, for some reason, they are all too busy, then I will make a point of finding the time to hear out your ideas myself. I say this because while it's true that no administration has a monopoly on good ideas, My administration is always on the lookout for the best ideas. There is an old African proverb that goes, "Tomorrow belongs to the people who prepare for it today." As governor, I am determined to make sure that we do everything necessary to prepare for the future that beacons before the people of Guam. To do that, I need planners. I need you. I commend you all for making the choice to not just sit back and complain about the way things are, but instead to be part of the solution and help chart a brighter future for the island we all call Guam. Thank you for all the hard work that you do. Thank you for taking time out to be here today. And from the bottom of my heart, I say to you, may you all have a great 2020 Assembly of Planners Symposium. Sidzu'us Masi for your attention.
Thank you, Governor, for those very inspiring words. How about another round of applause for Governor Leon Guerrero? At this time, I'd like to call up my predecessor and my mentor, Ms. Evangeline, Lujan, who was the former CZM administrator, to the report on the Climate Change and Resiliency Commission.
Thank you so much, Edwin, and thank you everyone for coming to this. I am Evangeline Lujan. I am the governor's appointee for the Climate Change Resiliency Commission. I'm the chair. Romina King is the vice chair. Austin Shelton and Michelle are public members, and Walter Leon Guerrero and Tyrone Taitano are also on the committee. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. First, I want to present the vulnerability assessment on built infrastructure. How many people have gone to our workshop? Because on our climate commission, we had a workshop as the first action of the commission. There were several people I thought that were part of that. So if you've seen this, then it might bring back some information to you. But the one thing that I want you to be able to take from this is that this presentation will probably be on something from one of the websites, right, Edwin? And I'll also provide Romina's executive summary. So if I'm not doing a good job explaining the slides, you can have a reference and contact Romina. In 2015, the Assistant Secretary of the Office of Insular Affairs came to Guam and decided that climate change is going to be a priority for DOI. It has actually been part of the Obama administration, and they had a climate change task force and resiliency at that time. In 2015, an executive order was created by Governor Calvo that established a climate change resiliency and science advisory. That was when Guam was able to get some money from the TAP grant to do a climate change vulnerability assessment. Money was awarded to the governor's office, but it took some time for the University of Guam and Romina King to receive the money, so they didn't receive it until later part of 2018-19. They really only had 9 months to prepare for this study. So what ended up happening was the results of this study sort of was at the time for the results of the study sort of coincided with the governor's declaration and executive order that established the climate change resiliency, which is replaced the 2015 climate change executive order. When we talk about vulnerability, we're really talking about how resources are impacted and the ability for them to survive under multiple different circumstances. We talk about three dimensions under climate change, which is exposure, sensitivity, and adaptation, and the ability for natural resources and in fact people to be able to adapt to those three changes. Romina decided to look at infrastructure along the coastline. When you do a vulnerability assessment, you must do it for multiple different sectors, but they really didn't have enough time. So what they looked at was critical infrastructure, power, water, wastewater, road networks, and buildings. They looked at the scenarios for both 3 feet, 5 feet, and 10 feet. They were interested in what would the infrastructure that we are concerned with, how will sea level rise affect that infrastructure, and which villages are most vulnerable to these socially as well as through the lack of infrastructure resulting from the impacts of climate change. They used 3 methods, GIS analysis and participatory GIS. That was done with Caitlin. She had 3 students work on it. Caitlin Bautista. They did the local early action plan that was done with Marcel Higgs, and the social vulnerability index, which was done by Edward Leon Guerrero. That was their approach, was to use these tools and these approaches to determine the vulnerability. The first thing that they did was gather the data. They use a wide variety of data and modeling tools as well. A lot came from NOAA, the sea level rise viewer, flood exposure, tide gauges. They took the large-scale climate change models related to sea level rise down to something that is more consistent for what Guam is, because these models are really used for larger areas, and so we're basically just a pixel. So what they had to do was get a downscale model that would be applied to islands. Then they were able to take with the assistance of BSP and some of the government of Guam agencies, gather all the different data and assess some of the information that they needed. They worked with Chip Guard, they did the analysis, and they presented the report. There's a lot that is required to do a downscale model. So what they did was they ran a lot of different assessment modeling tools, and then they came up with 3 scenarios, but here are some of them. They wanted to use a mid scenario and a high scenario related to annual rainfall. These are bad slides. Wet season, dry season, and annual temperature. But what you will see, and the most important thing that you'll see, is that even in the mid scenario, the projections are that we will probably have a slight decrease in annual typhoons at the mid scenario. And even at the high scenario for sea level rise, we will also have a decrease in the amount of temperature. But we will have an increase in temperature and about an average rainfall of about decrease of about 10% or 10 to 15% drier. So if I'm going to put my GWA hat on, that's not good because we get our inventory from rain. And so if we're having a drier season, that means that we have to do a better job in terms of managing our aquifer. So basically they ran all the models, they looked at all these different scenarios, and essentially what they came out with, what they have more confidence in, is that we will probably have a 3-foot sea level rise by the end of the century. And you may be thinking, well, 3 feet's not that big of a deal, right? Because our houses are elevated, or at least there's some things. But if you go along the south, though that's at sea level already, even Agate, there's many places where a lot of our infrastructure and a lot of people live and depend on living on this coastline. And of course, in all of our knowledge of coastal management, most people want to live on the coastline. A large percentage of people live on the coastline because of many different reasons, but it's a high valued area. So that is one of the concerns that we have, is that as we're moving forward and developing and planning, we have to take into consideration some of these models, especially the 3-foot rise. So what are we going to be doing? This higher sea level can increase as storm inundation from typhoons and tropical storms. We all see on social media all those videos during just high rain events of what's happening down in the south with the flooding. So these are very critical and important concerns. So the result of the GIS, because they took all these different GIS models, is this. 58% of the total infrastructure will be impacted by this sea level rise. If we use a 5% model, that means 74% will be impacted. And if we use a 10-foot scenario, then it would be 84 feet. That's a lot, right? So then villages that are impacted will, by the 3-level or any of these scenarios, will have a huge impact, especially in southern villages or villages on the coastline. The other thing is that if we wanted to look at some of the areas in the south, it's really 73% of the areas in the south are impacted. That's pretty high. And then in the central areas, 27% of central areas are being impacted. They have maps that are associated with this. In fact, here are some. This is another difficult map to read, but what she has here is for everything, they've identified the different types of infrastructure in the buildings. And then they've identified, you'll see that the largest areas are in the south, agate, Umatic. Here's the 5%, this is a lot of data. Okay, this is now the important one. So the results are that these are just models. So what they did is at the last All Planners Climate Change workshop that we did, one of the things that we did was find out from the people what their concerns were, because you want to take what the data is saying based on what people are feeling about the concerns that they have. And of the 180 responses, they found that most people are highly concerned about the impacts to infrastructure. 41 people out of the 108 were concerned about natural resources. And then 37% of the people in the group were concerned about infrastructure. And about culture. And it's not to say that we're not concerned about culture, but survival is the big thing. You have to feel safe, and you want to make sure that you have the resources you need, water and power and the basic necessities. And if your house is underwater, it's very difficult to think about other things. So when they looked at the criteria, they looked at built environments, natural environments, and cultural environments, and see what the population felt about it. They did maps for each of these scenarios, and so they showed these maps to the participants, and then that's how they decided on the criteria what they were most concerned about. This is they have multiple GIS layers that shows these areas, and not just this particular area, but throughout the island. And so these maps are available with Romina, and I'm sure with the Climate Center, and it's going to be available as part of the Climate Commission. The other thing that they did was these things called local early action planning. And in 2019, the Nature Conservancy led this effort. And we got together with a bunch of planners and a cross-sector of the population to do a workshop about what our local actions could be. Because if you understand what's happening in your past, you can better plan for the future. So this is another bad slide, but what it has was, what they did with all the participants is saying, okay, so what do you think your history of climate change is? And a lot of people relate climate change to typhoons and storms. And so it started you can't see this very well, but the first in the group, majority of the people, their first recollection of typhoons were in the 70s, 76, I think, Typhoon Pamela. So most people, as we're seeing the population, we have a very young population, that they already have forgotten some of the impacts of Typhoon Karen. But Typhoon Karen really started to change the face of Guam. But we don't have that historic knowledge. And so one of the things about addressing climate change is really understanding the history of it so that you can better make decisions. So within the group, they asked questions like, what do you perceive was like the first, all the storms in the history? So there's also another issue with what people perceive to be the times and the impact versus what was actual. And so here's one where we can actually see the slide. And it was starting with typhoon, which typhoon is this? Oh, I'm sorry, there, 1996. And so I don't know what the name was. I don't think they had the name. But Typhoon Paka was the one. They knew that there was a typhoon, but they didn't even know the name. So really the group of people that work, that's the other thing, is really trying to get the right people in the room. Because one of the ones that people know is Typhoon Paka, which is really kind of like 1997. We were already doing our thing by 1997. So it's sort of like what people perceive and what the actual times are. That's the other issue related to how do you address climate change and its issues, is what people are perceiving to be the timelines and what people perceive to be the issues. And so then we went all the way to 2018. The takeaway from that LEAP exercise was that typhoons tend to be the key marker for climate change. But what we're seeing in the previous modeling was that we're going to be having less typhoons, but probably more intense storms. So, and we're seeing that now, right? We're not necessarily having typhoons, but we're having a large amount of rain in a short period of time that causes flooding. So typhoons may not necessarily be the marker anymore. Maybe it's going to be high rain events or prolonged drought times. The other thing is that maybe this model, this local early action planning may not necessarily be good for urban settings. Maybe it's more good, maybe it's something that is better suited for small gatherings that deal mostly with social change. So, having said that, one of the other things that vulnerability assessment study showed is, this portion was done by Edward Leon Guerrero, was that that's a critical part. It's not only about infrastructure, it's also about how the people are going to be related, how they will be impacted by these changes. So this social vulnerability model is used by, Romina wanted to use something that can be compared nationally. So she used the Center of Disease Control social vulnerability model. The social vulnerability model looks at age, gender, race, ethnicity, health status, access to physical and non-physical resources, well-being, food security, safety, displacement, and migration. So she utilized the data that was available through the 2010 census. It broke up the information into 4 themes: social economic status, household and composition and disability, minority status and language, housing and transportation. So then what she did was she used the 2010 census. They have a model there, and they used the 15 vulnerabilities. They did an interpretation, and they organized it by villages. They had population, and then they're into tables. And so they're actually easier to understand, and each village can take that information and see the changes. What's good about this, about the 2010 census data, is that we're doing the 2020 census. So after the 2020 census, we can rerun this model and see what things have really changed. But most importantly, too, is that we're using the models from the Center of Disease Control, and so it's the same models all the other states are using, and so we can have some level of comparison. So here are the results from that vulnerability assessment. The social part of it is the top 3 areas that are most vulnerable are Agate, Mongmong Totomaiti, and Agana. Interestingly, not Umatic, Maritso, Inarahan, because this is really looking at housing and other things. Remember, we looked at infrastructure previously. Now this is the social component based on other things. The top 3 least vulnerable areas are Pidi, Santa Rita, and Asan Maina. Why would that be? Well, she has it monitored with all the data, and they have it color-coded. They did a scatter diagram for this, and to see how they're close to the medium. What they found was that this particular model for social economic vulnerability, there was some limitations to it. It emphasizes certain variables over others, that it homogenizes the population, and reflects, it may not reflect the unique social and physical environment of Guam. The conclusions are that the tool is useful to pinpoint certain areas of social vulnerabilities, but what it did was take a lot of the Caucasian populations had a lot of influence in it. And so back to the vulnerable villages, what it looked at was the different types of people that live in those villages. So basically, the Agate, Mongmong Totomaiti, and Agana do not have a variety of populations that live in those areas, and they also they don't have as many Caucasians living in there, because there's this, part of the limitations of this is the assumption that ethnicity does impact your socioeconomic status and your ability to be more resilient. So that's why Agate, Mongmong Totomaiti, and Agana are most socially vulnerable villages. And so with that in mind, because we also see like the types of people, and this will be interesting in this 2020 census because people have changed residences, how that changes. So this is something that you could utilize, but you may not want to. We want to be able to look at other types of populations, including the FSM, right, which may or may not be taken into consideration in those areas. But what we did find was and we all know this, there's a direct relationship with your socioeconomic status and how you're going to be able to meet the impacts of climate change. And it has a lot to do with housing. So some of the recommendations that we have will be from this is to maintain, in order for us to maintain a good, healthy coastline, reduce exposure and vulnerability of the built infrastructure, strengthen governance, maintain livelihoods, reduce risk, we really need to create a climate change adaptation plan. One that also includes vulnerability to naturally based solutions. That includes things like increasing shoreline through vegetative means or other non-built structures. So one of the other things is that maybe we need to look at the goals of the sustainable goals for climate change related to related to the UN, which is what we're doing with the G3. Having said that, we were very fortunate that we've been supported by the governor and Tyrone in developing a climate change resiliency commission. We have some data now. One of the things about working with people that are scientists is before they make any kind of decision, they want to make sure that they've created all kinds of models and all the data is available. And so we were very fortunate that the vulnerability assessment was done and that we can utilize that information under the Climate Change Resiliency Commission. So that's one of the things. I mentioned the members. The mission is to create an integrated strategy that builds on resiliencies against climate change and the reduce of greenhouse emissions. There are several working groups that include energy, water resources, oceans and land, infrastructure, community resiliency, development and planning, food security, public health and safety, greenhouse emissions, and carbon footprints. If anybody in this room is interested in participating in any of these working groups, please let me or Tyrone know so that we can invite you. We've had several meetings now, and so part of our meetings is really trying to integrate the other initiative, which is the Guam Green Growth, because there's a climate change component in that. So there are many different things that have been already done. Tyrone mentioned many of them. The coral reef resiliency strategy, all of these things. So it's not necessarily that we're starting from scratch. A lot of the work has been, you have all been involved in a lot of the work that is going to be included in this integrated plan. The status is that we've had several meetings now. We work and we're coordinating with the Guam Green Growth and the UN Sustainability Goals so that it's consistent and we're not, one plan is saying to do something and another plan is not. The other thing is that we're looking for the gaps. So Tyrone mentioned all the different types of plans that are out there. But one of the things that these plans have is strategies to address their specific. So if you're doing specific content needs. So if you're doing coral reefs, there's activities that address that. This is going to integrate that and try to see so that with our limited resources and our capacity, we really have to be smart about how we're going to utilize the resources that we have to address this. One of the things, though, that we're trying to do in the commission is look for those gaps. And one of the gaps that we find is really about building along the coastline and utilizing the University of Guam School of Engineering. Their project now is to develop housing that if you are sitting in the coast, what are your new design criteria? So that way, if you are going to be inundated by 3-foot waves or 3 sea level rise that's happening, what kind of designs? Because land is very scarce here. It's not like we can always move to another location. So we have to give alternatives for people. So the University of Guam is going to be working with our commission in developing different building designs to address sea level rise, as well as utilizing different materials in another way so that we can address some of these issues. So if you have any questions, please ask Romina, and there's her email address. So thank you so much. And if you're interested in being part of our commission, we welcome your input because everybody working would really help us move this thing. And it's great because, you know, you have a breadth of knowledge in your specific fields. Thank you.
Coming up, this segment will discuss real-life scenarios of flooding issues around the island with a panel of government environmental, engineering, and land use experts.